Welcome to session number 2 of an introduction to worldviews and apologetics. I'm Dr. John McMath. I'm joined with an international group of friends in Italy and the Philippines and here in the US. This is session 2 of an introduction to worldviews and apologetics. We just got started last week with a kind of an overview of what we mean by a worldview. A worldview makes a world of difference because it's the framework that we use to understand everything. It's a grand unifying theory of everything that allows us to function in the world. Without a worldview, you are essentially what the psychologists call schizophrenic. That means you're incapable of dealing with the actual world. You just can't do it. You have to have some way of functioning. Everybody has a worldview. Even people who say that they don't, they still have one. It may be an inconsistent worldview. It may be a mixture of several conflicting worldviews. There are people who try to live that way. But everybody has a worldview. And it's important for us to kind of begin to recognize what people are saying when they tell us what they believe, or how to tell what they believe from what they're saying about other things. And it's very helpful to have that information in order to know how to talk with people. If we're going to develop relationships and friendships and eventually share the gospel, it's very helpful to know where people are coming from. So today we're going to move from the broad introduction down to the first of the 7 logical worldview possibilities. And it's going to be the easiest for us to get in touch with because it's the worldview that we hold. This is theism, or the belief that there is in fact a God. I need to say before we walk anywhere further that if you ask most people, well, particularly in the West, do you believe in God? I think the last time there was a big survey of that kind of question, I forgot who did it. It's something like 80% of people will say, oh yes, I believe in God. And by that, they typically mean that they are theistic. They believe that there is a God. That doesn't answer a whole lot of really important questions. Okay, simply believing that there is a God doesn't mean that you're a saved person. It doesn't even particularly mean that you're a Christian. Believing in God is a very low bar to set, and most people in the West believe in God, but that doesn't change their lives very much. So we've got a whole lot more to cover before we really know anything. But theism itself, the belief that there is an infinite creator God who is outside the material universe and yet can work within that universe, is a distinctive worldview. It's the starting point for the great Western and Middle Eastern religions. So let's go ahead and share the screen here, and we'll go from there. Let me see here. There it is. Whoops. There it is. Okay. You'll notice I've got 3 pictures on this slide. I've got a synagogue on the left, a mosque in the middle, and a cathedral on the right. What do Jews, Muslims, and Christians have in common? Well, they all say they believe in God. So theism, from the Greek word theos, or the Latin deus, holds that there is something more than the world. The material universe is not all there is. There is also an infinite God who created the world. Again, all of the words in that definition are important. The distinction between the creation and the creator is very important. The idea that the world is created, that is, it came into being, is an important distinctive of theism. The belief that there is in fact a creator who is an adequate explanation for the universe is a very important idea. And this is shared by Judaism, by Islam, and by Christianity. All three of these are theistic in the broadest sense of the world. Of course, the difference with Judaism and Islam, as opposed to Christianity, is that Judaism and Islam insist on one God, radically one, atomistically one. So there is no room for a triune God. The idea of a Father, a Son, and a Holy Spirit is a distinctively Christian concept. Matter of fact, if you say that you believe in the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that puts you within the subcategory of theism that we call Christianity. Doesn't make you a believer. There are lots of people who believe in the Trinity who are lost, but it's a step in the right direction. There's again, all of this kind of fits together. So theism is a world plus an infinite God. We're going to be contrasting this next week. I'm going to go really rapidly through theism because we're all in this camp, and so we understand it a little bit. Next week, we're going to look at atheism, which is not quite the opposite of theism. But atheism holds that there is not now, never has been a God. The material universe is literally all there is. And some hold that the material universe is infinite, it is eternal. That would, of course, make the material universe God, but most atheists don't go there. I find atheism a really interesting thing to study, and so we're going to look at that next week, and we might actually take 2 weeks to dig our way through atheism. Theism, however, is interesting. Classical theism in the Western sense, let me see where my cursor is, there it is back in the classical world, the best representatives are not Jewish or Muslim. I'm not going to give you any quotations from Jews and Muslims because, frankly, none of them do very much in the way of either philosophy or theology of religion. There's not a whole lot there. There are some medieval Jewish thinkers who are important. And there is a strain of Muslim thought that we call the Kalam argument that is interesting in developing the argument for the existence of God. But we're not going to go there because, frankly, I'm going to try to do this whole thing in one session. Okay, but there are 3 thinkers. Augustine, who lived around 430 AD, Thomas Aquinas, who lived around 1100 AD, and then some modern philosophers, René Descartes around 1650, the Enlightenment, Gottfried Leibniz around 1700, who in some very important ways defended theism broadly. In the modern era, a man who died oh my goodness! It's hard to call him modern anymore. He died 50 years ago. But the most popular modern writer in English is probably C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Narnia series, and He Is There and He Is Not Silent, and Mere Christianity, and some other stuff. In English, C.S. Lewis is very well known and is very important for the clarity of his writing. Quite a unique character. So we're going to look at Augustine, Aquinas, and then C.S. Lewis as representatives. Okay, there are a lot of versions of theism. Some of the distinctions are really important. Yes, so like the distinction between Islam and Christianity is really important. So simply calling someone a theist doesn't really answer the questions, but it's a start. Theists come to their position through a variety of philosophic methods. Some use a rational method, some use an existential method, some use a phenomenal method, some are analytical, some are empirical. Now, all of these are different technical versions of philosophy. So Descartes and Leibniz, for example, are going to come at their proofs for the existence of God in different ways. And this is not to say that one is right and the other is wrong. They're simply different. And they arrive at similar conclusions from different places. Most theists believe that the material world is real. Okay, now that again may not come as a gigantic surprise. There are some who believe that the material world exists only in minds. So perhaps it exists partially in my mind. Whatever I personally experience exists for me. And what you personally experience exists for you. But the whole material universe exists in its entirety for God. Okay. Which is an interesting idea. It really doesn't make very much sense. It's not a particularly useful concept, but there are some, the existential and the phenomenal approaches of philosophy will take you there. And I don't think that that's a place that's worth going, but you recognize that there are some who are theistic who are there. Most theists believe that God is unchangeable. If God is infinite, which is a part of the definition of theism, then he is, by definition, unchangeable. A complete and perfect God has nowhere to grow. He's arrived, so God cannot evolve. There are some who believe that they are theists who believe that God can evolve or change. I would argue that those people are not theistic at all because they believe in a less than perfect God. Nevertheless, some theists believe that God can evolve. Most importantly, Christians are Trinitarian. If you're theistic and Christian, then you believe in a Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. People who say that they are Christian and yet don't believe in the Holy Spirit or don't believe that Jesus is God are not really Christian. They're missing the point. Although they may still be theistic, they may still believe that God is infinite and outside of the material universe. Jews and Muslims believe that God is one. Now, it's also important that Jews and Muslims disagree with one another about some very important issues. The fact that they agree that they believe in the God of Abraham is actually a fairly minor point because they disagree on so much that is different. So let's take a look. We're going to start with Augustine. And this is probably a pretty good image of him. This was done during the Renaissance, and is only 1,000 or so years removed from the time Augustine actually lived. So who knows how he actually lived? He almost certainly didn't own one of those pointy hats that we see on the right. He probably did not have a crucifix. The crucifix hadn't been invented by the time of Augustine, so there's a lot wrong with this picture, but it may be something like what he looked like. Augustine lived in what we call late antiquity, or the beginning of the Middle Ages, and he is the greatest of the early Christian philosophers. The church fathers between the time of Christ and the time of Augustine did some outstanding things. The martyrs lived and died during that period. There were some great men, but none of them hold a candle to Augustine. Augustine wrote widely, he researched widely, he had a phenomenal mind. His background in Greek philosophy particularly stood him very well. Augustine is influenced primarily by Plato and Plato's followers. So for Augustine, the idea that Plato put forward of of the necessity of a prime mover, a first cause for the universe, drove him to the idea of theism. Augustine began his career as a near pagan. He lived in North Africa, the area of Africa that we call Tunisia today. And he came through a kind of a dualism called Manichaeanism, very interesting pagan philosophy that we're not going to bother with very much. Manichaeanism held a simplistic view of the world. The body and everything else material is evil. The soul, however, and spiritual things are good. It's based on some of the ideas of Plato in a very superficial way. There was an emphasis on vegetarianism, and particularly everything that we see in the literature on a diet that is rich in cucumbers. Now, I cannot possibly imagine why that was true. There's nothing particularly sacred about cucumbers, as far as I know. Nevertheless, that would be where Augustine started with. And this dualism, the body is evil, the soul is good, is central to Plato's view of the world. There's an upper story where God or the good lives, and a lower story, which is the material universe. This is the basis for medieval monasticism. There's an upward path of salvation as we leave the world behind to become more and more holy. There's a downward path of creation as God emanates his goodness downwards, and it becomes increasingly more evil until finally it becomes the universe. And Augustine picked up on a lot of that. And he finally realized that that just didn't work. And he came finally to Christian theism under the tutelage of the Bishop of Milan, a fellow by the name of Ambrose, way back when, during that period. Those of you in Italy might want to visit the cathedral in Milan, and you'll see a great big bronze door, set of doors with Ambrose, very famous character who probably helped Augustine see the truth of Christianity. So Augustine is the preeminent Christian philosopher of the front end, the early Middle Ages, late antiquity, early Middle Ages. Okay, so what did Augustine teach? We're going to go through some quotes from Augustine just to think through what it was that he was teaching. For Augustine, God is the self-existing, I am who I am. He is uncreated, immutable, eternal, indivisible, perfect, and personal. In fact, tri-personal. God in one eternal substance in three unconfused persons. This is the language here, the vocabulary that we use here is Augustine's contribution to the doctrine of the Trinity. He is eternal. He lives outside of time and is therefore uncreated. And an important concept here is uncaused. He was not caused by anything else. He cannot not exist. He is necessary in the philosophic sense. God is omnipotent. That is, he has all power. Omnipresent, omniscient. He is eternal and transcendent. But by transcendent, I mean he is beyond the universe. He is outside of the material universe. And at the same time, he is the sustaining cause of all things. So he is both outside the universe and consistently always involved. He is the sustaining cause. Again, that's a philosophical movement that is actually quite important. It's one thing to say that God is the first cause. Far back in eternity past, he's the one that tossed everything into being. And another thing entirely to say that it is God who holds all things together, as the Bible says. Both Colossians and Hebrews use that phrase of sustaining all things. And that's a very important concept. Augustine gives us that language. God is the necessary being who depends on nothing. So God would exist whether anything else did or not. I mean, the rest of us are quite literally unnecessary. It is nice to have everything else, and I'm sure our God is happy that he created, but he doesn't need the creation. On him, everything else depends for existence itself. So fairly important concepts, and Augustine gives us this. Here's a quote from, this is from City of God. Out of nothing didst thou create heaven and earth, a great thing at a small, because thou art almighty and good, to make all things good, even the great heaven and the small earth. So, according to Augustine, the world is not eternal. Important point. It had a beginning, yet not in time, but with time. So the beginning cannot be found in time. We can't look back in time and say, okay, this is the point in time when the clock was reading such and such. That's when creation happened. According to Augustine, time began when the universe began, and God is outside of time. It's an important distinction. For a God who is time-bound is not eternal. He is not infinite. The world, on the other hand, is temporal and changing. And from those facts, the theist concludes that there must be, and emphasis here on the word must be, an eternal and unchanging being who made it. The cause of a time-bound, changing universe must be outside of it, logically. And that necessary cause must be both eternal and unchanging. And we're not going to walk all the way through all of the arguments there, but that ought to be intuitive. What I mean there is that anyone who considers the heavens and the earth and the material universe ought to logically come to the conclusion that somebody big enough to create all of this must exist. It's simple. And yet we find also a very complex notion. Okay, since God made the world, he can intervene in it. This is what we call a miracle. This is an artist's representation of the crossing of the Red Sea, one of the great miracles of the Old Testament. Okay, when things happen, Augustine said, this is in his Confessions, when things happen in a continuous kind of river of ever-flowing succession, they are called natural. When, for the admonition of men, they are thrust in by an unusual changeableness, they are called miracles. Okay, what Augustine is saying there is when you look out at the Red Sea, and it's the same level today as it has been all week, and the tides come in and the tides go out, nothing really changes, we call that natural. When Moses holds out his rod, a strong wind comes up and the sea is driven in both directions so that people walk on dry ground, people say to themselves, that's different. That's not the way things usually go. God has intervened. God can act in the world. And those great unusual events are called miracles. Okay, we're going to look at some more modern definitions of miracle. We'll talk about what that means, but the important thing is that since God made the world, he can get involved in it. There's no part of the theistic definition that insists that God stay away from the world. Of course, he can intervene in it, and therefore miracles are always possible. However, Augustine would insist that even nature's regular activities are the acts of God. Okay, Who draws the water up through the root of the vine to the bunch of grapes and makes the wine, except God, who, while man plants and waters, himself giveth the increase? We live, my wife and I live on a patch of forest here in Idaho with great big trees. And this time of year, we've had lots of rain. So the trees are all growing. You can just see them creaking their stumps and getting bigger moment by moment, it seems almost. There's a miracle there. How does that water get 30 or 40 meters up in a tree and all the way out into the needles and the leaves? How is that accomplished? The mechanism is actually fairly interesting, fairly complex, capillary action, the different pressures and stuff. But who designed that? Who made that happen? Who sustains that? Augustine would say, the regular activities of nature are in fact the acts of God. Many years ago, when our first child was born, I was privileged to be in the delivery room. And I remember our OB-GYN, the doctor who delivered the baby, lifting the baby up and giving her a good swat and giving her to the nurses while working with the placenta and some other things. And he held that up, and through his mask, I heard him say, every time I do this, I recognize what a magnificent miracle birth is. And of course, he didn't mean miracle in the sense of a direct divine intervention transgressing the laws of nature. He meant that God is at work in the natural, regular activities of the world. There is something wonderful in what God routinely does. So we don't need miracles to prove God. We just look at the actual events of nature. Let's go on. What about man? According to Augustine, man is not eternal. In other words, this is the Sistine Chapel. Those of you in Italy sometimes go to the Vatican, and it is worth the entrance fee to get into the Vatican Museum. And you'll walk through the Sistine Chapel. You're not allowed to take pictures in there, so you have to get your pictures off the internet like I did. This is God on the right giving life to Adam. Man is not eternal. He had a beginning point. Man is composed of a mortal body and an eternal soul. The spiritual dimension of a man is made in the image of God. So that makes man a rather unique creature. Horses and elephants and carabao and teddy bear hamsters are not made in the image of God. They are definitely made by God and sustained by God, but there's something different about man that's important in theism. The existence of evil in the world is real, but evil is not a substance. The origin of evil is the revolt of free creatures against God. Then this is a quote from Augustine. In fact, sin is so much a voluntary evil that it is not sin at all unless it is voluntary. Okay, it's the revolt of free creatures is where evil comes from. Gollum could have remained Smeagol. He chose to covet the ring. That's Lord of the Rings stuff for those who like that. So what about ethics then? Is there a difference between right and wrong? Augustine believed that God is love by his very nature. Since man's obligation to his creator is to be morally godlike, man has a moral obligation to love God and his neighbor, because my neighbor is made in God's image. So essentially, if you love God and you love your neighbor, Jesus said, that fulfills all of the law. So there is an absolute set of standards by which right and wrong are to be judged. That's the Christian view of ethics. That's actually the Jewish view of ethics and even the Muslim view of ethics. There is an absolute and a standard. Is history going anywhere? Augustine wrote the first Christian philosophy of history. That's the little book, City of God. And in this, he describes a city of God and a city of man. The city of God, of course, belonging to God, and the city of man actually belonging to Satan, having very different destinies of heaven and hell. And I don't agree with everything that Augustine wrote in the City of God, but I do agree that history is moving toward a goal. That is, history is linear. It had a beginning with the creation, and it will have an ending with a very distinctive set of end time events where there will be an ultimate victory of God over Satan, of good over evil. Augustine said, history is his story. Now, that's not actually Augustine's words. He said it in Latin. But the working out of God's sovereign plan, in the end, he will defeat evil and perfect man. So there's a linear quality to history that makes it intentional. God is working out a purpose. Okay, Augustine put all of that together. These are the distinctives that are important to him. Let's look at Thomas Aquinas, and we're going to go a little more quickly. Thomas Aquinas died in 1274. He's the high point of what we call the scholastic era. Aquinas forms the closing bookend for the Middle Ages, 800 years after Augustine. So we've got 800 years that we can call the Middle Ages. And he is very similar to Augustine in his view of God. Let's take a look at a few things. Most of this comes from Aquinas' Summa Theologica, and a couple of his minor works, but Summa Theologica is where most of the quotations come from. For Aquinas, the basic attribute of God is pure actuality. And he of course wrote in Latin, but that's a good translation of that. I am who I am is pure actuality. God is existence, pure and simple. Everything else merely has existence and is composed of actuality, what is right now in actuality, and potentiality, that which is to come. So I change and grow over time. God does not. He is entirely actual. He is completely perfect. He is finished in the sense that there's nothing that needs to be added. God is a necessary being. Aquinas is the one who gives us the term necessitas, necessary. He cannot not be. It is not possible for God not to exist. It's simply logically, it's philosophically impossible. So God has no potentiality. He does not and cannot change. Nothing in God ever changes. Here's a quote from Summa Theologica. God, who is not other than his being, is a universally perfect being. So God is perfect in everything and can't be otherwise. So what do we know about the rest of it? Aquinas says that the universe, everything that exists apart from God, was created from nothing. Aquinas gives us the term ex nihilo. And Augustine would have agreed with that had he thought of it, but and he uses the same kind of language, but it's Aquinas who gives us this term. There was absolutely nothing before, and God made something from nothing. The universe is therefore contingent. Contingent is another philosophical term that means a thing that might not be, a thing that did not exist once and might well not exist in the future, but just happens to exist at the moment. So I have a cup here on my desk that is a contingent being. It was made in a cup factory, of course, in China. And one of these days I will tire of it and toss it, and it will go into a crusher, and there will be no more cup. It is contingent. It is entirely dependent on my good will. If I decide that this cup should go away, it will. I am the same way. I exist, and yet there was a time I did not. There will be a time when I do not. My existence is contingent on another. Aquinas would say, if God were to withdraw his sustaining power, it would disappear in an instant. And he takes this, of course, from the scriptures. The New Testament is very, very clear that the universe will disappear with intense heat. As soon as God removes his sustaining power, the universe will simply destroy in a vast explosion, and it'll be over. The world is therefore not eternal. It does not exist out of time. And there was no time before time, only eternity. The word eternity means outside of time. It's, again, difficult for some people. Okay, now, what about miracles? God created the world and has sovereign control over it. So here's Jesus turning water into wine. These guys are pouring their water into the wine jugs. This is how Aquinas would say it. Divine art or intervention is not exhausted in the production of creatures, and therefore can operate otherwise than according to the customary course of nature. Aquinas agrees with Augustine on this. He's just using different language to say it. The fact that Jesus made water into wine, it wasn't really breaking laws. He was simply operating differently than the customary course of nature. Nature's laws are not absolute, Aquinas would say. They are merely the description of how things normally work. If God chooses sovereignly to intervene in some different way, we call that a miracle. God calls it business as usual, because in his universe, which is much larger than ours, making water into wine is something that can be done anytime he wants to. He's not breaking any laws. We sometimes say, well, a miracle breaks natural law. No, it doesn't. It has that appearance to us because we're so small. Anyway, so what about man? Here we are back in the Sistine Chapel. Man is a soul, body, unity, composition of form, which is the soul. The term form, it goes all the way back to Plato, and matter, a body. God's immortal soul survives physical death and will be united with a perfect resurrection body. Man is a little lower than the angels, but a little higher than the animals, created in the image of God. A lot of us modern theologians would disagree with Aquinas over the idea of man being lower than angels. Eventually, I'll get to that. I believe that man is a little lower than God and higher than the angels, but this is where Aquinas puts it. Human life is sacred, so murder is always wrong. Since God gives life, only God has the right to take it. So a lot, Aquinas really expands on Augustine's idea of the nature of man. Let's talk about evil for a bit. Essentially, the same as Augustine. Evil is a free choice. Aquinas would say a deprivation of good, a privation, not a nature or a real essence. It is the negation in a subject. God is so powerful that he can make good even out of evil. Hence, many good things would be missed if God permitted no evil to exist. This is an insight from Aquinas that goes well beyond Augustine. Doesn't disagree with Augustine, goes well beyond him. Here, Aquinas is actually building on Romans 8:28. We know that God works all things together for the good of those who love him, who are the called according to his purpose. Very important New Testament text. And one of the implications of that is that God is at work in all things that happen in the world. So God permits evil in the universe, not because God is evil or because he is not powerful enough to make it go away, but because there are good things that God intends to produce that require the presence of evil in the system. And again, that's not someplace we're going to dwell on, but it's an important concept, and Aquinas is the source of that. So ethics. Ethical laws reflect the nature of God himself. A thing is right, not because God wills it, but because it is by nature consistent with the essence of God and therefore right. So a thing is right not because God is arbitrary and it says, oh, it could go either way. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to decide that murder is wrong. God could not command other than against murder in the commandment, because life is of God's essence, and the taking unlawfully of human life is always, under every circumstance, wrong, not because God simply decided that's the way it would be, but because that law is a reflection of the character of God himself. Okay. Important concept, and all of ethics is like this. Okay, the history and the goal of history. Aquinas would agree with Augustine. History is linear. It moves in a line toward a goal in which the wicked will be punished, the good will see God face to face. We speak of the term the beatific vision. And this is a marble example of that that we find in, that's actually in Rome. I don't think that's in the Vatican, but it's in Rome. Okay, our third example of theism is C.S. Lewis. Died back in 1963. I can remember first reading C.S. Lewis when I was in college, and he'd already been dead for several years. But I found him fascinating. Is probably the most influential 20th century Christian theist in English. Francis Schaeffer, perhaps, is in the same category, and he did a lot of his work in French. C.S. Lewis was an atheist and a professor at Oxford University in England. His great ability was really literature. He was able to explain complex ideas in simple language. If I'm trying to introduce Christianity to someone who has very little background, I will often use C.S. Lewis. Say, here, read this little book, and afterwards we'll have a talk about it. So Mere Christianity is a great one to share, or the Narnia series. If you're trying to introduce children to Christianity, Narnia is a good place. Let's talk about Narnia while we're at it. This is Aslan the lion, who is a god character in the Narnia tradition. Lewis accepted the traditional Augustine, Anselm, Aquinas view of God as eternal, necessary, transcendent, morally perfect, a personal being. He began his famous Mere Christianity by arguing that an objective moral law, such as even common disagreements presuppose, entails a moral lawgiver. C.S. Lewis is famous for his moral argument for the existence of God. And it goes like this: there is something which is directing the universe and which appears to me as a law urging me to do right and making me feel responsible and uncomfortable when I do wrong. I think we have to assume it is something more like a mind than it is like anything else we know. Because after all, the only thing we know is matter, and you can hardly imagine a bit of matter giving instructions. Okay, so there is a mind of infinite proportions, which is directing the universe. That's God. Here's some quotes. I'm going to do some quotes from C.S. Lewis because I just happen to like them. This is from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Aslan is a lion, the great lion. Ooh, said Susan. I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? Safe, said Mr. Beaver. Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. So that's he's not a tame lion is a quote that comes from C.S. Lewis. So you visualize the powerful king. That's the lion. So what do we know? Lewis rejected his previous argument that God could not exist because of the presence of injustice. When we look at atheism next week, you'll discover that one of the great arguments for atheism, and I believe a thoroughly failed argument, is that evil exists in the world. Therefore, if God was good, he would be upset that there was evil. If he was powerful, he could make it go away. Therefore, God doesn't exist. But Lewis gets into this. He says, just how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. Not only is God absolutely perfect, but he also transcends time and space. Almost certainly, God is not in time. His life does not consist of moments following one another It is always present for him. So a little bit about God. I want to show you some quotes because these are kind of fun. He who has God and everything else has no more than he who has God only, which is that's a good way of saying it. Okay, what about the world? Lewis taught creation ex nihilo, same as Aquinas. He taught that matter is not eternal and is in fact a product of a cosmic mind. This idea of the cosmic mind is a very C.S. Lewis kind of thing. The freedom of God consists in the fact that no cause other than himself produces his acts, and no external obstacle impedes them, that his own goodness is the root from which they all grow, and his own omnipotence, the air in which they all flower. God didn't create the world because he had to. He created it because he wanted to. The existence of the universe is entirely contingent on the goodwill of the creator. Years ago, an American theologian prior to the American Revolution, Jonathan Edwards, wrote a sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. It essentially says exactly this. The sinful man walks, as it were, on a rotten covering, held every moment out of the very flames of hell by the hands of God, a God who is justly angry with his sin. C.S. Lewis would agree with that. Okay, some more quotes from Lewis. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. Lewis would argue that Christian theism makes sense of everything that he sees. Here's another good quote. I like this. If there ever was a time that nothing existed, then nothing would exist now, because nothing comes from nothing. Everything has to have a cause. Okay, let's think about miracles. Lewis believed that nature is not the whole of reality. The natural world is not a closed box with nothing on the outside. He taught that miracles and nature are interlocked and intricately related because both have their origin in God and are guided according to his purpose and design. God is bigger than our view of the laws of nature. God normally operates within the laws of nature, but that doesn't mean that's the only way he can work. Okay, this we've seen all the way back to Augustine. This is the theistic way of speaking of miracles. Okay, another quotation just for the fun of it. I gave in and admitted that God was God. God has to be God because I'm not, and yet I exist. So God has to be God. Okay, evil. According to Lewis, evil is not eternal. And that actually is a very, very important point. Evil is not eternal, as the philosophic idea of dualism claims. In Plato, there are two equal and opposite poles, the good and the evil, the material and the spiritual. Christianity agrees with dualism that the universe is at war, but it does not think that this is a war between independent powers. It thinks it's a civil war, a rebellion, that we are living in a part of the universe that is occupied by the rebel, Satan himself. That's a great quote. I like that. Where does evil come from? Evil comes from the abuse of free will. Every act of freedom is not a good thing. But we are free to do evil. We are free to sin. We're free to go to hell if that's what we choose. Evil comes from the abuse of free will. Fallen man is not simply an imperfect creature who needs improvement. He is a rebel who must lay down his arms. The essence of sin is free will. Okay, and then this quote again, because I like the picture in the background. A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. So the reality is that God has laid down a standard. We can know what crooked is because we know what straight is. Okay, where is history going? This is an altarpiece in some cathedral or another. I've forgotten where I took this picture, but anyway, it's an altarpiece of the final judgment. There's Christ in the center, taking the blessed on his right hand and the cursed on his left hand. In the end, life is the proving ground for eternity. In the end, there are only two kinds of people: those who say to God, "Thy will be done," and those to whom God says, "Thy will be done." So ultimately, it's a choice. There is real freedom. C.S. Lewis believed in personal, responsible, human free will. And this is essential to most theistic arguments. And the choice of damnation and eternity in hell is a free choice. We're not sent there because God decided he doesn't like us. It's a choice. Okay, so summarizing the basic beliefs of theism. I'm just going to lay this out in 7 basic ideas. First, God exists beyond and in the world. The big words: he is both transcendent and immanent. Transcendent means he's beyond, he is outside. Immanent means with us. The name Emmanuel is built on that word. Actually, this word is built on the Hebrew word that means with us. But transcendent and immanent. Secondly, the world was created out of nothing, ex nihilo. The idea of creation is a very important concept of theism. Christians in particular who reject the idea of creation are essentially rejecting the core tenet of theism. I consider that a very dangerous thing to do. 3, miracles are possible and have occurred. The Bible tells us about lots of them. 4, man is made in God's image. That's primarily a spiritual thing, but that's basic. There is a moral law. Moral law is absolute and it exists in the character of God himself. And 6thly, man is immortal, composed of a mortal body and an immortal soul. And the part of me that lives forever is important. 7th, man will be rewarded or punished. History has a goal. It is linear. It's leading toward a judgment day. So let's evaluate theism. We're going to do this with each of the worldviews as we come to them, because there are some things that are good and some things that are questionable, that may be criticized in every worldview. So some contributions of theism. 1, this is an exalted view of God. There's something intuitively appealing about an ultimate being who is absolutely perfect. I mean, that's a good thing, just in general. If you were looking at a variety of different worldviews and one proposes a God who is perfect, that's an attractive characteristic. Secondly, theism provides an absolute basis for morality. In other words, morality is not relative. It's not dependent on how I'm feeling today. If, a person who picks up his pistol and walks into a grocery store to kill some clerks is doing an evil thing, and it is absolutely wrong. It doesn't matter how he feels or even whether or not he's sane. It's a wrong thing to do, and that's not relative. Thirdly, the dignity of man. Theism provides the basis for treating other human beings with dignity. Most worldviews hold man in fairly high regard, even the atheistic. They believe that humans should be treated with value and respect, but only theism provides a firm basis for that belief. It's the atheist, we're going to look at atheism next week, believes in human dignity, he says, but he has no reason for believing that. If man is merely nicely evolved slime mold, how is there any basis for dignity there? There's not. And why should I treat a bit of slime mold with honor or respect? I shouldn't. It's a stupid thing to do. And there are more and more in the modern world who choose to behave as though mankind has no dignity. That's what the abortion debate is about. That's what the transvestite controversies are about, homosexuality. All of the perversions are an indignity against mankind as a concept. And then finally, life has ultimate meaning. Adherents of other worldviews often conclude that life is not worth living. Atheism is a rejection of life itself, and there seems to be a death wish in atheism. And even in pantheism, we'll look at pantheism in a couple of weeks. But within the theistic worldview, life has ultimate meaning. Life is worth living. Theism offers a purpose. So, are there some criticisms? Oh, yes. Some non-theists believe that theism is too good to be true. Sigmund Freud is a good example of this, a famous inventor of psychoanalysis. We say to ourselves, Freud says, it would indeed be very nice if there were a God who was both a creator of the world and benevolent providence, if there were a moral world order and a future life. But at the same time, it is very odd that this is all just as we should wish it ourselves. Okay, and so a belief in God is quite a satisfying thing. Therefore, Freud says it must be wrong. But I'm not sure that a satisfying worldview is necessarily wrong. A worldview is not true because it's satisfying, but because it's true. Looking at the truth of a view is the main thing. Anyway, some criticism. Okay, some common objections to theism as a worldview. And they're in no particular order, but this is stuff that we're going to look at in some of the other sessions. First, the universe doesn't need a cause. If God doesn't need a cause, as you theists say, then neither does the world. And of course, there are answers to this, but we're not going to look at them today. Secondly, there could be an infinite series of causes. Why stop the process? The theist needs a better imagination. An infinite series of causes. Think about that for just a moment. An infinite series of anything real and material is frankly impossible. Visualize an infinite parking lot. But okay, I've been close to an infinite parking lot in traffic in Manila. For those of you who've been with us when we've done that, you look out ahead, and that's a stopped traffic between here and the airport is terrible. But eventually, we did in fact get to the airport. It was a finite series. An infinite parking lot can't exist. Why? Because in order to be infinite, there must always be room for one more car. But if it is in fact infinite, then it already contains all the cars. And it is therefore impossible. It's impossible to view an infinite series of causes for the current state of affairs. Eventually, the sequence has to stop, and that first cause has to be outside of the world. It cannot be another finite cause. The fourth view, the universe need not be designed. Evolution can explain everything. There's no need for a designer. This is a very common modern objection. Evolution is wonderful. Look at all the wonderful things evolution does. Any careful look at the design of anything will demonstrate that evolution can't work, but we'll go there. Fifthly, theism is otherworldly in outlook, and this leads to neglect of responsibilities in this life. Some have said that, and that may be an objection to some of the medieval monasticism. Theism absolutizes inhumanities. All sorts of inhumane acts have been done in the name of an absolute God. True enough. But that is not a problem with theism, that's a problem with sin. Anyway, these are common objections. These are some of the places that we're going to end up eventually going. When we get back together next Wednesday, we're going to start on this slide right here, atheism, a world without God. We'll start out with Friedrich Nietzsche and see where we get with that. Let me see if I can find my stop share. There it is. Okay. Thanks everybody for coming. It's good to see everybody. I wish I could be there with you. I wish, Paul, I wish I could join you in Ravenna next Sunday. That would be, I'll tell you what, I would love to be there. Love to see you all. And those of you in Como and Cosenza, all the places you are there, we miss you all. Don, Oscar, it's good to see the Italian cohort, and it's good to see the Filipino cohort. Let's see if I can make our bye-bye happen. Yeah. Okay, we're going to take off now. Thanks for, there's Donna fading in and out of my picture. That's it. Hey, look at that. She fades in, she fades out. And part of her fades in, part of her fades out. Isn't this fun? I think this is a bug, not a feature. Anyway, love you all. We'll see you again next week. Do take care.
Pastor Paul.
Bye-bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.